Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, May 26th, and I want to start you off with the clip. Let's
Okay.
try this.
I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? We're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into Kiev and other cities. I don't like it at all.
President, what do you want to do about
And
that?
I'm surprised. I'm very surprised. We'll see what we're going to do. What am I going to tell you? You're the fake news, aren't you? You're totally fake. All right, any other questions? I don't like what Putin is doing, not even a little bit. He's killing people. And something happened to this guy, and I don't like it.
Uh-oh. So
Yeah.
Trump doesn't like it. What
Right.
happened to Putin? Something happened to this guy. Can you tell us what happened?
Right. Well, what he said there reflected a Truth Social post, which I'm assuming he did before he made those comments to the reporters. Yeah, so, he said pretty much the same thing. But, he said he's gone completely crazy, all caps for crazy. And he also said he's firing missiles and drones into Ukrainian cities for no reason at all. Uh, yeah, so this is Trump. We have to remind ourselves. I think again, it's very easy to forget really how shallow a mind he has. I think he really does. Sort of he has a childlike, very naive understanding of how the world works, um, and yeah, what is he talking about? Of course, Russia has launched a lot of missile and drone attacks on cities in Ukraine. But this is something they've done before. It's been part of their um, the war that they've been waging against Ukraine for the last 2 or 3 years. It's intensified somewhat recently, um, but I don't know why this means Putin has gone completely crazy. It's part of a strategy clearly that has been worked out over time and has been very successful and has degraded Ukraine's military capabilities and its logistical capabilities, and they're going to continue to do it. Absent a ceasefire, a settlement, they're going to continue to do it. So why is he having these hysterics? Well, I don't know. Was there something that Putin told him to suggest that, oh yeah, I'm going to lay off. I'm not going to fight so hard now. There's no indication of that. There's none of the comments that he made earlier that Trump made earlier were to that effect. Um, I have a sneaking suspicion that Kellogg is behind this, at least in part behind this, because Kellogg came out with a post on X not too long, just a couple of days ago, or maybe it was even yesterday, harshly condemning these missile and drone attacks, and suggesting that they were barbaric, they were intended to kill civilians. And so maybe, he got Trump's ear and reported this, or maybe Trump just watched Fox News and that's the way things are reported. Because again, whenever the Russians launch a missile attack, and if there are any civilian casualties or if any civilian structure is damaged in the attack, even if there isn't any, there's always a claim that there is. And then it becomes, well, that's what it's all about. And they don't talk about actually the clear military objectives. For in the case of Kiev, which you mentioned, there was a very large drone factory that was the main target of that attack. And obviously, the Russians have a very good reason to go after that. Of course, we've talked about the importance of drones to this war, and then in particular, in recent days and weeks, the Ukrainians have been sending, fleet after fleet of drones. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of drones, and so why wouldn't Putin, go after this factory in Kiev? Of course he has to, as long as he's waging this war, he has to do that. So it just seems to me utterly silly. And we were talking about, I think in the last program that, okay, yeah, at the moment, Trump seems to be drifting towards Putin's position. But I use the word drifting, purposely, because I don't think he's not made a real um, that's a real decision, something based on the facts. He analyzed and decided, okay, this is the right position to take. It's just like, okay, we had this conversation, me and Vlad, and the things are going great. We're going to have negotiations, and then, so he's drifting towards Putin's position. When this happens, and then you saw the result. But I remember in the last program I mentioned that what happens when the Russian army starts marching towards Kiev or towards the Dnieper. There's a huge breakthrough. Is Trump going to be able to, maintain his happy attitude? And clearly not. We saw this. This was actually very minor, and the whole thing seems to break down. We'll see. Maybe he'll be be making positive comments about Putin in just a very short while, in a few days from now. You never know with Trump. But I think in the long run, they're just like he's incapable of really, clearly he has not worked out a position, that is going to get him through all the difficulties ahead. Because again, if he thinks he's under pressure now, just again, imagine when the Russians are marching on the Dnieper, what kind of pressure he's going to be under. If he can't stand it now, there's just no way that he'll be able to stand it then.
Can you give me a little more context for this drone attack that the Russians gave? I know that the Ukrainians have been increasing drone attacks on civilian targets within Russia. I also heard, can you verify this, if there was an assassination attempt on Putin in his helicopter in Kursk? So was this drone and missile strike by Russia more retaliatory, or was it strategic?
Okay, well, the Russians themselves say that it's retaliatory. I actually don't believe them. I mean, I think this is part of information warfare. This is something they're going to do because that's not the way Putin works, to be honest. He has a strategy and he sticks to it. That's how he's doing it. And these made strategic sense, right? You go after a huge drone factory in Kiev. That's what you're going to do. And, there were attacks on deployment points in Sumy, and, all these things had military value. But they did frame it as retaliatory. And, you mentioned, or I earlier mentioned all these, drone attacks, almost entirely against civilian structures and civilians themselves over the last few days and weeks. But you also mentioned, a possible assassination attempt. I don't think it was an assassination attempt, but when Putin visited the Kursk region, just a few days ago, his helicopter flew into a drone swarm, Ukrainian drones, one of these waves of drones that had been launched by the Ukrainians. And I guess they shot them all down, all the ones that threatened the helicopter, and the helicopter landed without incident. It's not at all clear that this was an assassination attempt. I don't think the Russians have claimed that. I may be wrong, but I haven't seen that claim. I think it was an accident. It was just they sent the drones that way because they were going to do it, and his helicopter happened to be flying, right towards them. But yeah, that's scary. And again, that very point was brought up with Trump by a reporter later, and said, "Did you know about this? About the apparent assassination attempt on Putin by Ukrainian drones?" And he said, "Oh, no, I didn't hear about that." Well, that maybe kind of explains what he's doing. And so we'll see.
Right. Yeah. I think Trump is just watching mainstream media.
Yeah.
I was watching BBC last night, and they had a segment over Ukraine, and there was no mention of Ukrainian drone attacks in Russia. There's no mention of this assassination attempt on Putin. But they had a guest on that kept on saying how Putin was enacting a genocide on the Ukrainian people. She was using that word over and over again. And there was all this coverage on the civilian deaths and how horrific this is. So if you're watching that and you're seeing, and there's no pushback from the interviewer on using the term for genocide, for example, in Ukraine. And so I just, we inhabit different realities. I mean, I guess, do you think most Europeans now inhabit our reality, real reality, or are they inhabiting BBC reality? It is interesting. What I like to watch a little bit every day, just because it does show you that it's like, this is what This is what the institution, the establishment, is putting out there.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Actually, again, I think I mentioned maybe he just got this from Fox News. He could have got it from any mainstream news source, because Russian missile attacks are always characterized in that way. I don't think they usually use the word genocide, but it's just like they emphasize if there were civilian deaths, then it becomes all about the civilian deaths. Well, clearly, the Russians were targeting this kindergarten. They sent this $10 million missile or $1 million missile to strike a kindergarten or a children's cancer ward in a hospital or whatever, which is just absurd. Again, we know these attacks take place every night. There have been hundreds and hundreds of these attacks, and night after night they're hitting again, military infrastructure, logistical infrastructure. And every once in a while, maybe a missile goes astray. This is inevitable. Or even more likely, an air defense interceptor fired by the Ukrainians, lands in a wrong place. It's not intentional by either side, but this is, a horrible truth about war. This happens occasionally. Now, the use of the word genocide is just beyond absurd. This war is actually an outlier in terms of civilian casualties. And it's an outlier in the sense that actually civilian casualties are much lower than what has been normal for this kind of war over the last several decades. It's just the opposite of what we're seeing in Gaza, which is an outlier in the other direction. The vast majority of casualties are civilians. But it's the great majority of casualties in this war are soldiers. This is a war between armies, and occasionally, civilians get killed. That's always going to happen, and it's terrible, and it's tragic, and it should be reported. But I'm sure there are some bad apples in the Russian army that occasionally target civilians. It just always happens. It was true of, the U.S. Army in World War II and Korea. These things happen. It certainly happened in Vietnam. There's the famous My Lai massacre. I haven't seen any evidence of it. I think it's been very small scale on the part of the Russians. But there is regular evidence of Ukrainians going after civilians. I mean, it's actually daily. If you pay attention, it's just, these are generally FPV drone attacks, which can be on ambulances, school buses, markets. There was a double tack market attack in Kherson that killed like a dozen people. It was clearly deliberate. I mean, when you're talking about FPVs, you know what you're doing, right? It's not just a missile you fired in that direction. No, you see, there's the market. I'm going to hit it. There are a bunch of people right there in the middle. So there are deliberate civilian attacks, regular, not just the occasional bad apple, which maybe happens on the Russian side. But again, I haven't even seen evidence of that. But I wouldn't be surprised if occasionally it happens on the Russian side. But it's just regular on the part of the Ukrainians. But still, the scale of it, even on the Ukrainian side, is just much, much lower than what we've seen in Gaza. And I think maybe just because they don't have the means, and Russian air defense is good, very, very good. But yeah, talking about a genocide is beyond absurd, but that's how these things are reported. And I think you're right that Trump, I have trouble believing it, but he still inhabits, that media universe or media bubble, which is where so much of the U.S. population and the European population, where they're still getting their information.
I think the Ukrainians maybe feel they have to use language like genocide because of what Israel's doing in Gaza. It's almost like they're competing for attention and sympathy. We need Europe. Don't worry about what's happening between Israel and Gaza, especially if Europe's kind of on the side of Israel. It's kind of, we're not exactly sure the stance is changing.
We've had
they could, right. But they're feeling
when they
internal.
actually start sanctioning them and whatever, and then I'll say, okay, maybe we're seeing a real change, but it's still just rhetoric. And so I think at this point we have to say they're completely on the side of Israel. The governments are. Right.
So, I mean, you could see if that puts Ukraine in a tough spot where what we have is clear evidence of a genocide in Gaza, and the Western leaders are supporting that. And the populations are becoming more and more sympathetic with the Palestinians for obvious reason because of the footage that's coming out. But no, we need to get sympathy for the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have to compete with the Palestinian genocide. You know what I mean? Do you think that's kind of what's playing in their mind?
I think you're right. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Um, yeah, well, I think it actually just what's happened in Gaza has affected, in general, the world's opinion of the Russian SMO, because the contrast just couldn't be greater. It's enormous, and anybody who's looking at it at all honestly sees it, and then sees the utter hypocrisy of the West. Yeah, in condemning, the one war that's being conducted conventionally and actually by, standards of the last several decades, unusually light on civilian casualties. They condemn that, but they look the other way and support the genocide, the true genocide that is taking place in Gaza. Yeah, and that's a double standard that's just so blatant. Yeah, you're gonna do what you can to fight it, just not through reality, but through information warfare.
Right. What does the latest drone and missile attack on Ukraine tell us about the status of Ukraine's air defenses at the moment?
Well, it shows that they're very weak. I think in this recent attack on Kiev, many, the residents of Kiev actually reported just watching these drones come overhead completely unmolested and then strike again and again, one after another drone. Now, drones in general are easier to hit than missiles. They travel much more slowly. Though that's not true when it comes to Patriot systems. Patriot systems are good at hitting ballistic missiles. They're not. There's nothing's perfect, nothing's fail safe, but they're good. That's really what they were developed for, was as a defense system against ballistic missiles. But they're not very good at all. They really can't deal with low flying, slow flying drones. So that may be part of it, but it seems that in general, yeah, again, Kiev would be the one city where you're going to see the most, the best air defense within Ukraine. And there seems to be very little air defense left. The reports are, of course, that even the air defense systems, the batteries that remain, are generally without interceptors. They run out. And, I know Zelensky's been demanding more interceptors. And the Americans, like I think I heard Marco Rubio say just a couple of days ago, that we don't have them. And that's a fact. Even before the Ukraine war began, we were low on Patriot interceptors. And then for these other European systems, apparently, the Ukrainians have these batteries, but they're just empty. And so, they're just completely exposed. And if that's true in Kiev, it's going to be doubly and triply true in other cities.
So we just don't have any. We're just supplying month-to-month production to Ukraine with Patriot missiles, interceptors. Is that where we're at right now?
I would think so. We have to maintain a stockpile of some kind, for our own defense needs. I would hope that that's what we're doing, and that's what the Pentagon says they're doing. The last I heard, the U.S. is able to produce 550 interceptors a year, and that's not very much. Well, imagine that you gave all 550 of those to Ukraine, which is not what's going to happen. Some of them are going to be kept by the U.S. and some are going to go to Israel and, other places. But even if you, for the sake of argument, gave all 550 to Ukraine, remember that generally 2 missiles, on the average, they're $4 million on the average, are fired for each incoming missile. And so you have maybe 275 missiles come in. You got to fire your full complement of interceptors, and that's it. And then you got to wait another year. I mean, it's just not going to work, is it?
Yeah, it's but when the Ukrainians are firing drones and missiles, I guess they don't do missiles so much. There are a few ATACMS into Russia. Are they disabling them mostly through electronic warfare, or are they firing interceptors as well? Because interceptors are expensive. You think that the strategy you would adopt immediately is what we're seeing, what we saw Iran do with Israel, and what we're seeing Russia do with Ukraine, is you attrit you fire cheap missiles and drones at your opponent, and then they waste all these very expensive interceptor missiles that have a limited production capacity, limited supply. Why isn't the other side? Why isn't Ukraine able to do that? Why can't the Western side even do this? Seems like they're not able to.
Yeah, they may be trying. You would think, because they have been sending lots and lots of drones into Russian territory, and they're getting shot down. 99% of them are. I don't think that's much of an exaggeration. But yeah, the Russian they have a different what would you call it? Just sort of a portfolio, or air defense arsenal with. And I really should get back up up to speed on it, but I know that they use a combination of measures. There's EW, of course, which they're very good at, so a certain percentage are brought down that way, and that doesn't cost them anything. It's just the electric bill. And then there are also systems that are actually fire, I think, large caliber bullets, and then there are systems, air defense systems that are actually specially designed for dealing with drones, and so they do fire some kind of missile. But I guess I'm just assuming, I need to look into this. Now that you mention it, that's something I need to research. But I'm assuming that those missiles are much cheaper and easier to produce. They're not like the Patriot missiles, $4 million each, which aren't even very good at all against drones.
Okay, so let's say, imagine if you're a country and you are wanting to shop the global arms market to bolster your military, your defense. Where would you go for air defense systems? Would you buy the Patriot for any situation?
I think it's clearly that the S-400 would be a better choice. And that's why we had Turkey, even though it's a NATO country, decided to get S-400 systems, which infuriated the Americans, but that's what they did.
Can a NATO country do that? I mean, wouldn't NATO be able to? But then wouldn't the U.S. send, oh, great, now we got this S-400 system, we can copy and replicate it? You think that's something that's kind of proprietary that they wouldn't want to give to NATO?
I don't know exactly what arrangement. Obviously the Russians thought this all out ahead of time, but I don't know. Actually, what the reason that the Americans gave for penalizing the Turks for buying the system is that the S-400s would be able to collect data on their F-35s, other American planes. And so I guess the Russians are running these systems or something. I don't know. That's an interesting question. But it was the Americans that were infuriated about it, and they were afraid of, intelligence leaks. The big advantage that the S-400 has or at least one of them is over the Patriots, is that it deals with the full range of air threats. Again, I said the Patriot is really focused on ballistic missiles, but the S-400 can deal with everything from the slowest moving drone up to I don't know about hypersonic missiles, but certainly supersonic ballistic missiles and high altitude missiles. It can deal with a whole range of altitudes and speeds. And the Patriot can't do that. So that is a definite advantage that the S-400 has.
Okay, so you would buy the S-400 aircraft. What about missile defense or air defense?
Right, and that the S-500 is in development, but I think it's going to be put into operation soon. The S-500 takes it even farther. It would be able to shoot down satellites as well. That's so that's the advantage of these Russian systems. They're for the full spectrum of air threats.
Okay, well, what about aircraft? Where would you buy aircraft if you were going shopping?
I really don't know enough about it. I'll be honest with you. I can't. I really don't know. I guess both the Americans and the Russians are, they've developed fifth generation.
Or the Chinese shooting down Rafale jets at $40 million an aircraft opposed to 200 million, right? I mean,
yeah, at least 200 or maybe 180 million, something like that. Okay, I know. We've talked about that earlier. So yeah, that was definitely a good, let's say, sales demonstration, by the Chinese. Again, it maybe wasn't entirely fair, because it was just a brief skirmish. Or it's more than a skirmish. It clearly was. But um, I think to understand a system's capability, you need to follow it over the course of a war that lasts more than just a few days. But yeah, it's suggestive. I mean, it's very suggestive. Yeah, and that Chinese system, which is the J10C, is actually an older system which they have put out of service within China. But it did very well. And again, it did very well. I think part of the reason is that it's part of an integrated system. The Pakistanis bought the whole Chinese package, everything from radar stations, air defense, the planes, the missiles, they're all Chinese, and they're integrated. They work with each other. And that makes them, much more effective.
Right. Kind of what I'm getting at with these questions is that I think now we're at this point where countries are going to realize that the U.S. NATO military industrial complex is a paper tiger, was a paper tiger this whole time. Well, prior 5 years ago, if you're on the global arms market, I think everybody would be running to the U.S. stall and looking at all their fancy weapons. But right now, it just feels like, okay, air defense, aircraft, missiles, artillery, literally anything. It's like I wouldn't buy American anymore. I feel like that's going to be one of the outcomes of this war, and just I don't understand. I don't know how the U.S. military-industrial complex can survive after this war. But it's such a huge part of the United States. It's like if we lose that, the U.S. doesn't export anything at this point.
No, it's right. It's not just a matter of military prestige. Yeah, there are real economic consequences because, of course, our arms industry is a big part of our economy. And so, yeah, the failure by the Patriot system or whatever, that has huge economic repercussions. So I think there's always, a huge kind of information war. Whenever there's an embarrassment, let's say on the American side, there's a huge effort to spin it, cover it up, or maybe to play up an apparent failure on the Russian side. I mean, that's because billions and billions of dollars are at stake. It's not. Don't pretend that you're going to get just objective reports. There's going to be a real effort to spin, every incident that involves these systems.
Right, definitely. Well, since this, you saw that clip with Trump, do you think Trump has really changed his stance now in regards to Russia, or should we not even talk about it? He'll switch his mind.
Yeah, I think it's almost a mistake to talk too much about it. He'll change his mind again. He seemed to, again, when that other reporter mentioned the so-called assassination attempt, whether or not it was assassination attempt, you could at least claim that it was. He said, "Oh, well, maybe that explains it." So maybe he seized on that as an excuse, and then he'll continue to have a friendly attitude towards the Russians for a while. But again, there's a lot coming up. I think that there clearly is going to be. Well, I won't say clearly because we never know for sure, but there is in all likelihood going to be a major offensive that will start in the next few weeks by the Russians. And then again, you can imagine the news reports on BBC and Fox News and whatever. They're going to play it up, and Trump will probably be sitting in front of the TV watching that and say, "Oh my God, what's Vlad doing? He's gone completely crazy," and we'll be back to where we were just a few hours ago, or was it yesterday? And worse, that's the thing. And, actually the most worrying thing that I've heard recently is this came from the mouth of Merz, the German chancellor. He said that all restrictions had been lifted on missiles supplied by the UK, the US, France, and Germany. So I suppose that he's talking about, the restrictions that had been reimposed on ATACMS, when Trump took office. That seems to be, he didn't quite say that, but that seemed to be what he was saying. And we'll see if those attacks resume, then we know we're in real trouble. And it's not just that Trump was emotionally, upset, but but there has been a real change, a reversion to the bad old policies.
Well, with the ATACMS, how's it work with if this is a U.S. missile? Can the U.S. say don't use ATACMS, but then the Brits are like, you can use our Storm Shadows, or the Germans can say use our Taurus? Like, does each country have its own rules on its weapons and how they can be used in the Ukraine war? And then
Now, well, I've heard that, interestingly, in the case of the Storm Shadow and the Scalp. And the Scalp is basically the French version of the Storm Shadow. That actually Americans have to be involved in the operation of those missiles as well. Mm. And so if the Americans say no, then okay, those aren't used. Now the Taurus, we had been led to believe earlier that Mertz had backed off on that, but maybe not. Mertz is really crazy. I find the guy, genuinely frightening. And he may have pushed, and maybe now Germany will start supplying Taurus missiles and allowing them to be fired into pre-2014 Russian territory, which would be a very serious escalation. The Taurus has a much longer range than the other missiles. The ATACMS, the Scalps, and the Storm Shadows. I believe they all have about 300 kilometers. But the Taurus is 500 kilometers, so it could at least, reach the outskirts of Moscow.
Yeah, I have been seeing a renewed campaign online of release the Taurus. I've been seeing people pushing that, like it's time to step up, and defend against the Russian aggression, the invaders. And so I am seeing that. So you think that might actually happen?
Well, it might. Well, that was one place where Scholz, interestingly, Scholz caved in on everything. He said, "Oh no, we can't do that," and then Scholz, the human worm, would always, 3 weeks later say, "Well, I guess we've got to do that," But the one exception, the one place where he still had a backbone, was on the Taurus, and it may be that it was just the intelligence that had been provided to him. And I think like when Mertz was taking office, there was. I don't think it was Scholz, but somebody else was saying, well, when Mertz hears about, he gets briefed on the Taurus, I'm sure that he won't do it. So there hasn't been an official announcement, but his recent statement was very suggestive, and he clearly wants to. But I think within Germany, within the German defense establishment, there is some real resistance to it. We'll see what happens. But that would be a very serious escalation if the Taurus, is introduced into the war. Again, because as the German generals themselves, we had that recording that was leaked by the Russians. The German generals, they were talking about using the Taurus. It has to be done, with, NATO participation. This is the serious matter. Again, in the mainstream news, you almost never get this. Why can't the Ukrainians fire into Russian territory? The Russians are always firing into Ukrainian territory because it's not the Ukrainians. It would be the Germans, the French, the Americans, that are doing this. And so it becomes an attack by the Americans, by the Germans, whatever, on Russia. And that's just clearly a very serious escalation.
Do you think the Russians are scared of the Taurus at all, or doesn't?
I don't know that they're scared of it. Again, they've had great success. That's one of the things. I think one of the reasons why the ATACMS escalation, when Biden removed the restrictions on the ATACMS and began firing them into Russia last fall. Okay, we did have one, clear response to that, and that was the Oreshkin, right? Oreshnik. Yeah, I knew I got that reversed. The Oreshnik attack. They say, hey, look, if you do this, we do that. But then after that, there really wasn't much, to be honest. And I think it was because, again, they knew that Trump was coming. Trump had won the election, and Trump signaled that he would end, this policy. And he did, and so far as we know, he still has, it's just, he is not allowing so far. But again, the statement by Mertz causes us to worry. But anyway, I was just saying that one reason that the Russians have been reluctant to retaliate in a significant way, or have not, I should put it this way, have not felt pressured to retaliate, is that they've actually been very successful in neutralizing these threats like the ATACMS. So we have the ATACMS. We'll fire 6 ATACMS missiles, and all 6 of them are shot down. Now one or two did get through and killed some Russians. That's happened. But in general, the Russians have been very, very successful in neutralizing the ATACMS threat. And I think the same thing will happen with Taurus. Maybe initially, especially at the beginning, when it's a new weapon that's been introduced and the Russians don't have a profile on it. Some of those first strikes might do some real damage. But inevitably, as we've seen in all the other cases, like the Storm Shadow and the Scalp, the Russians will build up a profile, and they'll learn how to neutralize it so that it, you never can neutralize anything 100%, but they can neutralize it 70, 80, 90%. And, reduce the threat. But still, no matter what, it's an escalation. It is an attack by Germany on Russia. And it does put pressure on Putin to retaliate.
The way that the West has been engaging in this proxy war has been so damaging to NATO's strength in itself, because they've been piecemealing all of these weapons.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I hear you. Yeah, I don't know what happened. You went mute for a few seconds there. Okay,
I was just saying that the way that the West has been engaging in this war with Russia has been really damaging to NATO, its military strength, because they've been piecemealing these weapons one at a time. And we've seen Russia just be able to learn how to adapt to each one as it comes out. It's like, okay, you're rolling out the ATACMS. We'll spend a couple of weeks. Okay, we got it. All right, great. Next. Send out the Abrams. Okay, we've captured a few. We inspected. We know all their weak points, how to hit them with drones, disable them. Great. Next. And so it's one at a time. And now basically everything that NATO has, Russia's been able to disable the Excalibur artillery shells, F-16s, whatever it is,
right.
The Patriot systems, literally every system that they've sent, they've been able to inspect and destroy and neutralize. And so it's going to happen the same thing with the Taurus. Maybe you get 1 or 2 in, and then they figure out, okay, establish a profile. It's probably going to be quicker for them now because they've had so much practice with all the previous Western military equipment, that this is just another example of just throwing a product into this war where Russia's going to learn how to neutralize it, makes Russia more powerful, and has completely rendered this military product, worthless on the global market. Who wants to buy Tauruses now when the Russians say, here, you can download our anti-Taurus patch for $9.95 a month, no problem. So just the whole strategy behind it's so stupid.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. So now, when the Russians market an S-400 system,
right,
they can just do that with, including, anti-HIMARS, ATACMS, and now, Taurus, whatever.
Right. Basically anything that the West has. So, yeah, it's something that I come to this realization every now and then, like, my God, the U.S. military-industrial complex is done for because of the way how they handled this Ukraine war. It was, they could have... the possibility if they flooded everything at once, you could have had this initial advantage. They wouldn't be able to neutralize all these things in time, and it could really do some damage.
Right.
But just the way that this is rolled out, the way we've handled everything, I think it just can't be understated how damaging this has been to the U.S. military industrial complex. I personally think it's a death knell. It might take a little while for people to come to that realization. Mm-hmm. But if you have a country with a military budget, say we got $1 billion to spend, who's going to spend it on U.S. equipment? I just don't.
Yeah, well, of course, the Saudis just bought hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. equipment. But that may have been more of a,
to placate.
Political rather than, actually hard-headed military investment. I think that's probably true. They wanted to make Trump happy, keep on his good side. And, quite possibly, if you look at these packages, they're extended over many years, and quite possibly not all that money is going to be spent. But even if it is, right, I think it's really, they're buying goodwill more than they are buying military equipment. I think they understand that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe let's switch over to the Middle East. With the whole situation in Gaza, I don't know where to start, but maybe I'll start here. I'm hearing pressures now on Western governments to recognize Palestine as a state. Do you think that could actually happen? That we will see European countries formally recognize, UK, Britain, UK, France, Germany, any of these states?
It could happen. Again, it is really symbolic more than anything else. And they may be willing to engage in some symbolism because they feel the pressure, from their own people to create some distance between themselves and the ongoing genocide. So they might do it. I think there are a few European states that have done it already. Maybe Ireland, Norway, Spain, something like that. But yeah, it would be significant. It would be sort of a warning shot. I don't think, again, it doesn't change things substantively, but it would be a warning shot that Israel's position is slipping, or is in danger of slipping. Within the West.
I saw in Haaretz right before this that Israel is threatening to annex the whole West Bank if these European countries recognize Palestine as a state. I mean, if they do that, you immediately recognize it as a state, and then Israel immediately annexes it. How would that play out?
Well, if the Europeans are serious about recognizing it as a state, they would have to regard Israel as a hostile power. And in fact, though the truth is that most of the West Bank has been de facto annexed. Again, the Israelis just have what you have hundreds of thousands of settlers there, and have taken most of the land, have direct control over the land. So there's already a partial de facto annexation, but yeah, they would make it official, and that would be, it would make it harder for the Europeans to justify their support. But I think these people will find ways of doing it. Unfortunately, they will continue to support Israel. I'm excuse me for being very cynical, but it's just been going on for so long.
I was feeling like there was a general tone shift, and I feel like within mainstream media as well, they're not able to hold back the dam against Israel. Everybody's realizing, hey, this is not okay what you're doing, Israel. It's gotten to this point where we're just, we're seeing the starvation of children. It's becoming difficult to hide. Do you feel like we are entering a new phase where there will be serious repercussions for Israel, or is it just going to be more hand wringing and lip service, and the Gazans will just starve to death or completely be displaced?
Yeah, I'm afraid that these governments aren't going to do anything substantive. I think they've just found themselves in a tough place. They understand that their own people are very, very upset about this. And they may even be worried about the potential of war crimes tribunals or something like that in the future. And they're doing a little bit to protect themselves against that.
Wait, so you're insinuating that if they kind of admit what's going on right now, that they could be tried for war crimes, these Western countries?
Well, not if they admit, but actually by taking some at least symbolic measures, they can show that they, at least for the record, that, oh yeah, we tried to do something, and that we're not complicit in it. Maybe that wouldn't have any effect. Again, that's a fantasy that there would be war crimes tribunals. So, it's maybe a fantasy I'd like to indulge in, but I think it's still a fantasy. But I think maybe just for the historical record, they can pretend, at least to themselves, that they did something.
Do you think that'll work? History will write these people down as,
I think so,
part of the genocide, right? I mean, that allowed the genocide to happen.
I don't. Right. It's not fooling anybody who really sees what's going on. There's, we'll see. It's a good sign, but, it's just the fact that they're feeling this pressure tells you that the tide is changing against Israel. Now, unfortunately, it may I'm afraid that it's too late for the Gazans. I don't think these governments are going to do anything. But it does tell you something about what's happening, within the West, within the Western electorates. And somewhere down the road, I think we can see real consequences when we finally get a government that is serious about sanctioning Israel. And that, it could happen. Maybe it'll happen first in a place like Spain or whatever, where there's already some steps have been taken. But it could happen in France. It could happen in the UK. There's a lot of anger within the UK against the genocide in Gaza. And yeah, so it's something that in the long term, at least, I think it really does spell the end of Western support for Israel. But that may take years to play out, unfortunately, and the Gazans don't have years.
When you say too late for Gaza, what does that mean? Do you think that they will all be forcefully displaced and killed, or do you
I think there's
that
a real chance? There's no question that's what the Israelis want to do, and the West in general is not doing anything to prevent it. These comments, these statements notwithstanding. I saw, and it's not like, okay, well, we can hope that maybe Netanyahu will fall and his coalition government that includes, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they'll be out of there, and we'll have a saner Israeli government, and and the Gazans will be saved. Unfortunately, there's really no reason to have that hope, because even if Netanyahu does fall, the problem is Israel as a whole is in favor of ethnic cleansing. There was a poll, a really striking poll that came out. It was conducted by Penn State a few days ago of the Jewish Israeli population. And they found that 86% were in favor of ethnic cleansing Gaza, meaning, driving all Gazans out. 86%. So, any government that's going to come into power is going to be in favor of that. Now, amazingly, 56% of Jewish Israelis are in favor of ethnically cleansing Arab Israelis. In other words, the Palestinians that are Israeli citizens and constitute about 20% of the population there. They want to drive them out. So the majority of Jewish Israelis want, to drive their own fellow citizens out of the country. And then 47% were in favor of killing all Gazans in any territory that is captured by the IDF within Gaza. So just killing them all. So we're just talking about, we talk about these people like Chuck Schumer or whatever, try to frame it as like it's just a few bad apples, that we got to get rid of these guys like Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. But no, it's clear that, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, they're not really outliers. They use a certain kind of rhetoric that's not, it's not the kind of rhetoric that most Israelis would use, but they are essentially in favor of the same policies. That's what we're looking at. This is
that's wild,
right? This poll should have gotten a lot more attention. I mean, because again, you find that it's still so many people in the West, even the ones that are starting to be critical, they're still trying to defend the Israelis, and stopping short of using the word genocide. But the Israelis themselves, they're telling us, no, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. Again, it's just like anybody who's been paying attention has been hearing that poll. Still was something of a surprise to me, but it's not that much of a surprise because the kind of statements that you're hearing from all, people across the spectrum. And then, to the credit of a few politicians, there's one guy who's the head of the Democrats party. There's a leftist party within Israel. He said, essentially, he didn't use the word genocide, but he described, he said clearly the Israelis are guilty of war crimes and they're killing babies as a hobby. He used this, which infuriated a lot of, the vast majority of Israelis, including his leftist supporters. They didn't want to hear that. Maybe it's not quite a hobby. He shouldn't have used that word, but they clearly are intentionally killing babies. There is a genocidal program, and that's what he was saying. And then there was, I think, a former IDF general that came out and said something very similar. This is a systematic, deliberate, attack on the civilian population of Gaza. And so so even there are some dissidents, they're kind of voices in the wilderness within Israel. But then you have, on the other side, yeah, that's what we're doing. And they're celebrating, they're supported by the Poles. And this is happening in Israel. And then you get people trying to cover for them in the West. Say we can't be too critical of Israel. The Israelis themselves are just kind of coming out of the closet, so to speak, and saying, yeah, we're genocidal maniacs.
Well, if they're coming out and saying it themselves, then history definitely will write this down as a genocide. If they're just saying this openly, that we take Poles, we want to kill them all. That's so crazy. I mean, has there ever been anything historical where a population was on board with just killing a whole set of people? I'm sure there has been, right?
I think you certainly can find that in ancient history. I mean, certainly rulers back then were quite open about their genocidal wars.
Yeah, ancient history, but...
Yeah, right. But not in modern history, not, in the last... everybody points to the Germans in World War II. But, that whatever, the Nazis did, and some of it, I think, can be described as genocidal. No question about it. There's it wasn't live streamed, and most Germans weren't aware of it. It's something different. This time, and it wasn't because of just sort of a demand on the pressure from below to do this. Actually, you have pressure from below to go ahead with a genocide. I don't think that we have anything within, the last couple of centuries, or even, any time during the modern era. You have to go back to ancient times to find something like that. I don't claim to have done a careful survey, but, to my mind, I can't think of anything in the last several centuries like that.
How do you fix a problem like this if you have the majority, 86% of the population that is for ethnic cleansing? This is on a poll, I can't believe it. And then nearly half of them just support just killing them outright, not even trying to displace them. How can what future can that society have? How can that population heal? I mean, the solution isn't to kill those people either, right? I mean, I don't want anybody to die, but I mean, if you have a group of people that are just set on like their ideologies, we need to kill these people, then how do you solve that problem? Like if your neighbor is just like, I'm going to kill you every single day, that can't work, right?
Right. Well, I think it's like if there's any country that can turn this around, it's the United States, because Israel really is very, very dependent on the United States and couldn't even be continuing. We've talked about Iran. There's no way they can even attack Iran in any significant way without American support. But they couldn't have done what they have done already in Gaza without continual U.S. support. And they can't continue with their genocidal campaign there without U.S. support. And if that U.S. support is withdrawn, and in a not just in a very significant way, not another bullet, that's it. Then all of a sudden, Israel would find itself in a whole new world and say, we've made enemies of all the people around us. And actually, we cannot defend ourselves anymore. We need to bury the hatchet. And now it's going to be tough because you have these crazies, I think, who just wouldn't even be able to accept that. But maybe, a good percent of the percentage of the Israeli population would wake up and say, okay, let's talk. Maybe we did go overboard. Okay, we have to pursue a different policy. Well, it could lead to different outcomes. I think it would probably lead to a huge exodus from Israel, from the sane people. And then you would have a small group of crazies, but then those crazies could lose a war. That's if they don't have U.S. support. But, that's just not happening now, unfortunately. But maybe, again, because we are seeing something of a sea change within Western populations, and especially among the younger generation, maybe, at some time, I think almost inevitably, I should say more than maybe, sometime in the future, there will be a withdrawal, a significant lessening, and then a withdrawal of U.S. support. And then Israel will have to change course. Now, it may not be able to do it successfully. It may be, again, like I said, like half the population just gets out there and the crazies are left, and then you have a terrible war. But that would be a war that they would lose, I think, if, without U.S. support.
Wow. I'm not too surprised to see, Western Europe and the United States still stand with Israel this far. I am clearly, obviously, very disappointed that they've, despite everything over the past 19 months, they were just starting to see a little sign of tone change. But I am a little bit surprised that the rest of the world hasn't done anything. Are you? Did you expect that? The Arab countries would have just stood by while this happened, or we wouldn't have seen pressure from large players like Brazil, Russia, China, India.
Right. Well, okay. Yeah. Again, we've talked about the Arabs, and the Arab countries, the Arab governments are kind of like the European governments. They're just saying that, okay, they're starting to feel some pressure from below. And so we've got to say these things. And you see that from a lot of these Arab governments too. Yeah, we need to, because our people are really angry. Now we don't want to, we just want to it's not in our material interest to have a war with Israel. We don't give a damn about the Palestinians. Unfortunately, I think that's just the truth of these leaders of the Gulf monarchies and of Egypt and Turkey too, Erdogan. It's a very sad truth, but that's what's going on there. And then as for other countries, well, like Russia is involved in an existential war of its own. And the thing is, like, if Russia became involved directly in a really meaningful way, in a war against Israel, then it could find itself facing, or in a war against the U.S. It could be kind of quickly develop into that. They've got to think about that. The consequences could be enormous, for them. And I know this is I think too that, okay, there is this principle which I think really needs to be held to, and sometimes it's hard to, but if it's a mistake to ask your own citizens to go and die, for another country. You may be able to do it in the short, but in the long run, it's not your country. And again, you cannot keep those commitments. And like the U.S. in Vietnam is one example. Again, it was thought it was going to be quick and that we would, we would drive back the communists. This was our cause. But then it's when tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers were being killed. There's the Americans soured on it. You say, it's just that this is not our country. This is thousands of miles away. Maybe there was a good reason to do it, but we just can't support that. And I think it would be true for any country, because this, again, Israel has at least 200 nuclear weapons. It's supported by the U.S. If you become involved directly, that's something you're going to have to face. And again, if you're not close to it, you're not within the region, you're asking your citizens to go fight a war that, it may be very worthy. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be, but it's a war that's thousands and thousands of miles away, and asking them to die for this. And I think that that's always a mistake. Now, it should be the Arabs themselves that are doing something. And the one country, of course, is Yemen. These are their brothers. They're not, Palestine is not thousands of miles away. They're connected by blood and by religion, and they're in the same region. And so I think it is proper, and they're willing to do it. And they have suffered terrible consequences, right, for doing it. But I think the Yemenis understand these are our brothers and sisters, and we have to stand by them. Now, I think there are a lot of other people in the region that, look up to them and would like to do the same thing, would like their governments to pursue the same policy, but we have these very corrupt governments.
Yeah, I'm not even necessarily talking about a military intervention, though, but just, for example, forcing in some humanitarian aid. I think that would go real popular. I mean, it doesn't even have to be an altruistic act. Just to know that you will be going down on the right side of history. You think that some countries would do this. That you would force in a flotilla of aid, of medicine, life-saving medicine, and baby formula and food who can be so upset at this? I'm not talking about bringing in soldiers, there were some clips going around of Chinese jets airdropping food into Gaza. It's fake, as far as I know, but I saw that going around a lot, and people were like, "Yay, great, thank you, China." Everybody wants to see this happen. Right. That's why those things are going viral. It's like, surely somebody could do something. Can't we just drop food onto this captive population that's being bombed and starved to death? Like that's, or just have a policy. Isn't there an obligation with the Genocide Convention or whatever to stop something like this?
Yeah.
There's an obligation to do it, to say, as a state like Russia or China, sorry, we don't do trade with states that are engaged in genocide. That should be simple to do. That shouldn't trigger a nuclear war or drumming up support from your citizens. Everybody in every country around the world should be on board with that, would be proud of their country for saying, yes, thank you, our government for taking a stand, a little bit of a stand.
Right.
You're not asking us to go over and fight, but you're saying don't trade with a state that's doing genocide. Don't force in aid, feed these people.
Yeah. No, I agree, especially the economic sanctions. That is something that countries could do. And a few of them, have. But, and of course, the Yemenis have done the most because they are actually enforcing a kind of blockade, an economic blockade on Israel. Now, there are countries that could really have an impact on Israel, and one of them is Turkey. They could cut the flow of oil that's passing through that pipeline. It starts in Baku and Azerbaijan, passes through Turkey it ends up in Israel. They could cut that, and that would have an enormous impact. And of course, the Israelis do a lot of trade with Europe. As the Europeans got serious and said, okay, economic sanctions on Israel, this has just gone too far. They've rolled out their 17th package, and they're working on their 18th for Russia, but they can't do one for Israel. But if they did it, it would have a huge impact, much more of an impact than these 17 or 18 packages directed against Russia, which have had very little impact. Israel is a much smaller country. And again, I think much more dependent on European trade. And then, of course, the U.S., the impact would be enormous. Then that's something that it could do, without direct military intervention. Now, some of these humanitarian interventions that you're talking about, it's hard to prevent those from turning into military conflict. For example, if you, in fact, I think you're right that that's phony, the Chinese planes flying over Gaza. But if they did that, those planes could be shot down, and then we could have, a large conflict or an attempt to even bring in aid by boat. The Israelis would attack it. They've attacked them in the past, and they could. And if you're going to defend the boat, then you have a true military conflict, which could spiral out of control. So that's a little bit more difficult. But the economic sanctions could be done, and I think you're right, should be done.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've talked a lot about this, how military power, economic power, soft power, these are kind of like these three pillars of Western hegemony, and they've all been knocked down. And so we're having these power vacuums, essentially, that is occurring around the world. I think the military power vacuum is being largely filled by Russia, showing that this is becoming the new military superpower. There's not a single dominant hyperpower like we thought we had before, but we're seeing, okay, this is where a lot of military power is. Economic power, I think everybody is pretty clear that it's within BRICS, primarily China, that is filling that economic power. But then there's still this sort of vacuum in terms of the third one, which is the soft power, the moral power. And what we have here in Gaza has destroyed the moral power, the soft power of the West, but is creating a huge opportunity for some country to absorb some of that moral power, by being on the right side of history. So even just from a strategic point, from a country like China, taking a stance on this will all of a sudden solidify, it's got great military power, fantastic economic power. This would give a huge boost to its moral power, its soft power, which I think we've talked about before, is incredibly important, perhaps the most important one. It allows you to be the good people, the on the side of good. And I'm just surprised that other countries haven't taken even just from that opportunistic lens, that move. Because what we've seen, for example, now is Yemen. Nobody knew about Yemen, cared about it, even while it was being bombed nonstop by Saudi Arabia with our backing. Nobody knew about it. But now Yemen has become a moral superpower. Iran as well. People always had kind of a negative view of Iran, but now because it's kind of the head of the axis of resistance and supporting Yemen, it is establishing itself as a moral superpower. I think Professor Morandi, I was listening the other day, was saying that, just how Iran has become popular. He goes places and people are like, oh, we love Iran. Something you wouldn't really hear years ago. So it just, it's just surprising to me that I'm disappointing and surprising because I think even just in terms of a calculated self-interested move, it would make sense to put the sanctions on Israel as a country. You would become that moral superpower.
Right. I agree.
Countries like China did it.
Right.
Wow. Chinese popularity, boom, out the roof,
Right. No, I agree. Maybe there's something that I'm not seeing. There's some reason that these countries are reluctant to do it. Right? But I find your argument very convincing.
Yeah. So Xi Jinping, 如果你在听我们说这个, if you're listening to us, let's send in the aid, do the sanctions, something. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me ask one more question, just about Iran, and then we'll wrap it up. Because just tell me what's going on with Iran. I mean, to stay the negotiations, do we look like there's a strike coming on Iran?
Okay. There was a fifth round of negotiations held in Rome, again with the Omanis acting as intermediaries. So they were indirect negotiations. That's what the Iranians have insisted on so far. It was held on Friday, I believe. And going into that, we had Witkoff saying that, no enrichment. And the Iranians saying, well, if there's no enrichment, there's no point in talking because that's not something we're going to give up. And we're not giving up our civilian nuclear program. And Khamenei, made it clear that the negotiations are off, if that's what you're going to say. But they actually did go ahead with the negotiations, and came out of it with some kind of guarded optimism. So maybe the Americans have flip-flopped again, or they're doing something publicly and doing something else in private. I don't know. It's just really bizarre. I know earlier the Iranians said, they didn't actually use this word, but I think this is actually what they were saying. It's just that the Americans just seem to really be incompetent, just like not really focusing and not really understanding exactly what was going on. And it's, again, Witkoff, not to say the guy is stupid, I think he's a very intelligent man, but he has no background. He doesn't know these countries. He doesn't have any experience in diplomacy. Maybe even so, I'd rather have him doing this than Anthony Blinken, who is very experienced, but is just a, ideological zealot who's for war in every case. It seems like Witkoff, at least, when you get away from Palestine, is willing to entertain other possibilities. But anyway, I guess it came out and there were statements of kind of guarded optimism, and the Omani said they had maybe some sort of solution that would please both sides, and both sides were going to look at it, and we'll see. It's hard to understand what's going on because I don't see a coherent, consistent strategy on the part of the Americans here. And then we continue to get the noises from the usual suspects, mainly the Israelis, that they want to attack Iran and that they're going to do it. Now, they can't do it on their own. Even with, they would have to have American support. Again, they lack the refueling tankers. And they've had that support in the past. But even with American support, they can't accomplish very much. But maybe, they're hoping for some sort of provocation. If Israeli behavior is a guide in the past, is a guide to future actions, that's what they're going to try to do. They're going to try to create some kind of provocation, to attempt some decapitation strike or something, or maybe an attack on civilian infrastructure to try to get the Iranians to retaliate in a significant way and then draw the Americans in. I think that's clearly the strategy on the part of the Israelis. But they're, if the Americans stand firm and say, hey, we're negotiating with them, you're not going to do this, and we're not going to give you any kind of support, then the Israelis are the stuck. They really can't do anything. They
They'll
they
try.
they may very well try again, because I think we have just a very reckless and desperate Netanyahu. He wants, for his own reasons, even if the genocide continues with under somebody else, he wants to be the guy at the top, because he knows that if he is knocked out of power, he could very well end up in a jail cell.
It's ever since Trump came into office, I feel like we say, I don't know, a lot more. It's just so hard.
Yeah.
It's just everything's changing constantly with his position on Iran, his position on Russia. It's just...
Right. Again, but I would say with Iran, the fact, well, first of all, that he called off the Houthi campaign. Basically, I think he realized it didn't work, and maybe he can see that it just can't work for Iran. And the fact that those B-2 bombers were redeployed, from Diego Garcia, I think that's the most encouraging thing. I'm not even going to pay attention. I'll try not to pay attention. I know I will pay attention, but I'll try not to pay attention to what Witkoff says or Trump says from day to day. I think it's more important to look at, the real actions. And we're not poised to strike Iran. It's amazing, actually. I think it's important to consider, the fact that we had to use Diego Garcia. That's 5,000 kilometers away, and we have these bases right in the Gulf, which is just, a very short distance from Iran. Just, a hop, skip, and a jump. But we can't use them. I think it's clear that those Gulf monarchies have told us that, no, you can't launch any attacks from there. And you can't use our airspace, because they do not. They know that they could just be wiped out. They're very small and very fragile, and Iran could just utterly destroy them. It can certainly destroy the U.S. military bases there. And so we're looking at Diego Garcia, but it looks like we've even, if those reports about the B-2 bombers are true, that we've even given up on that idea. And I think that's a reason to be cautiously optimistic.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Well, let's end it there, Dad.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a bunch. Have a great day.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.